I'd like to welcome everyone to our first virtual keynote conversation of LCLC 50 in 2023. This is the big 50th anniversary of our conference here at the University of Louisville. And for tonight's event, we've got an opportunity to discuss by parties unknown. And we are graced to have Michael Morrow here, who is the principal subject, really, that introduces us to the facts of the Russellville lynching and the aftermath of it. And he is the director of the Sikh Museum in Russellville. And we're also joined by the director of the documentary, Josh Niedwick, who is a director and producer at PBS, and our guide. And I'm going to be relying on Laura Vrana, who has graciously given up her time this evening to lead the discussion. She's an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of South Alabama, with a research focus on 20th and 21st century African American poetics, with a research project on representations of lynching in the Black poetic tradition by writers such as Gwendolyn Brooks. She's published articles and book chapters in journals such as MELUS, Melius, College Literature, Book History, Tulsa Studies, and Women's Literature, Some Other Blues, New Perspectives on Amira Baraka, and the Cambridge African American Literature in Transition series, among others. And with Alden Lynn Nielsen, she is the co-editor of a really wonderful collection by one of America's foremost poets, the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas, which is a collection I enjoy very much. And with those preliminaries out of the way, I'd like to welcome our guests and turn it over to Laura to ask a question or two to get us started.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to folks for being here. And most of all, I think thanks to Michael and Josh for this important documentary, this very hard documentary, but that's bringing a lot of important subjects to light, and that I hope a lot of folks have had the opportunity or will have the opportunity to engage with at some point and to think about it in terms of their own communities as well. Yeah, I could ask a lot of types of questions about your process for this documentary, what you hope it'll open up, but just to get us going, and I hope you'll both kind of take this where you will, can we start the conversation just thinking a little bit about the histories informing and the aftermath of specific instances like this 1908 Russellville lynching. So when we think about what we're hoping to get people to understand about American history through such projects, let's talk a little bit, Michael and Josh, about your views of how, of course, all this is rooted in chattel slavery, how chattel slavery evolved, was not actually ended, into forms of racial domination, control, violence, terror, which then kind of evolved into these quote unquote sanctioned legal lynchings, and how that's redounding forward into American history. So let's just talk a little bit to get us going about some of those kinds of histories that that the documentary helpfully points us toward.
Michael, as always, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, please.
Well, in researching the 1908 lynching, what I found is that a lot of it was tied, like you said, to slavery. You know, when slavery ended, it was an effort not only in Kentucky, but all across the South. You wanted to put the slaves back where they were prior to freedom. And one way of that was to force them to back doors. Another way of that was to make sure I've got an article here that I found in the paper right in 1865, and it says in that article, it says, "Now we're watching all you black people. We don't want no black people to be meeting together. If you are meeting and there's not a white man there, you will die. We don't want no black people idle. If you're idle and not working, you'll be beat the first time. You will be killed the second time." You know, it goes on to tell that if a white man has blacks around him, they better be working. If not, he will be whooped. So it gives you an idea that even though slavery had ended, the mechanisms of force to keep slaves in line was still there. And it went on up till, like I said, it continued on up probably in some cases on up to the 1960s here. You know, people were beat. The first lynching here occurred in 1870, 1872, somewhere along in there. And you had two black guys lynched. And from then on, you had about 12 people lynched in Logan County. And we have the second highest lynching of any place in the state besides Fulton County, which is down in far western Kentucky. I found a couple of letters and a couple of more things where people are talking about how violent the people are here toward blacks. One guy wrote a letter, said the people are educated, they're wealthy, but he don't believe they consider it a crime to kill a black. They just as soon as shoot a black as they would a bird dog. Another guy, about 30 years later, he wrote the same letter and said the same thing. He said the people in Logan County are educated, they're fine people, but it was so you could get a mob together just as quick as dropping a hat when it comes to blacks. So it gives you an idea of what the situation really was here for blacks. Now, the problem is most whites never want to talk about it. What they'll tell you is that this is a good joy, it's been a good, joyful place, and we got along, and all this. But the reality was that blacks after the war here in Logan County and surrounding counties were terrorized into submission, I guess I'd say.
And that desire to believe and maintain a facade that that X, Y, or Z place didn't ever have those problems, I think is pervasive throughout many Southern communities today, where these conversations need to be happening and they're not happening, coming from Mobile, Alabama, which is arguably, depending on how you define lynching, the site of one of the last lynchings in America as late as the 1980s. There's very fraught conversations and silences about Mobile's really not very distant history for people in the community who are interested in trying to have discussions about racial reconciliation, and all the people who do not want those discussions to happen and want to put up a different type of facade. And so, yeah, building off of that, I suppose, what do we hope as people invested in this work, and what do you and Josh hope as artists and researchers creating a documentary can result in terms of, use the term racial reconciliation, I believe, in the film. What can those conversations look like? Where do we start them? Do we start them with screenings of films like this? How does that happen in communities across the South and across the country that don't want to have these conversations? These are obviously matters that weigh very heavily on your mind going into the project.
Well, I keep telling people you have to change people's hearts. We have a SNCC singer here, and he sings this song, and he's talking about how he fought SNCC in the 50s and 60s, and then when he got up to the 80s and 90s, he thought things had changed, but now he's looking at the same thing. Well, I think that's the situation a lot of people African Americans found themselves in. We thought that people's hearts had changed, but you're learning that a lot of people's hearts didn't change. They just kept them sour. All you can hope for with this film and anything else is that it reaches enough good people that they overshadow these bad people. It's all you can hope for. There's no guarantee that that will happen. Just no guarantee that it will. But that's all you can hope for. You hope that people in church groups and people in community groups will get together and start talking about it and say, well, this thing that happened shouldn't happen now. And the people that done it then are gone, but we shouldn't have people doing these things now. And that's all you can hope for. And it's hard to tell who's changing because we have been taught to put up a big facade. A lot of times people will come to you and they'll say, I'm for you and I'm changed and do this, and then they'll go to other people and get in small groups and put off something else. Like I said, and people's hearts don't change, their minds never change.
Absolutely. And we hope that storytelling and shedding light on, you know, the lives of individuals can play some part in that. And I have to imagine I'm not a documentary filmmaker, and I haven't worked on this kind of project the way you and Josh have. So I have to imagine the sort of the questions that go into figuring out how best ethically and morally and in terms of changing hearts to represent this story and try to bring to light these men's lives, not just their deaths, must weigh really heavily of what material gets selected to go into the project. You know, what do you choose to do with showing lynching photographs and not showing lynching photographs, and how did the two of you, I guess, collaborate and come to points of consensus about how to handle those decisions and edit down what I'm sure could have been a lot more material about this particular important event, and talk to us a little bit about that. I guess those conversations of decision-making process and how to represent this story in the best possible way for your purposes.
I'll let Josh handle it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And honestly, so this project took about 4 years from start to finish, and really the first 2 years was just relationship building and narrative understanding. The other producer, Neil Purcell, and I mean, we actually at the advice of my master's program advisor, went down to Montgomery, Alabama to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice with Michael to try to really push ourselves and put ourselves in the mindset of trying to view this from a completely different perspective and have that experience with him. And so what we ended up doing was just spend a lot of time with Michael, listening to this story over and over and over. And the amazing thing was each time we heard it, there was a new piece of information that got in there that we're like, oh wait, we didn't quite realize that. And so once we had a script, we sat down with Michael and just let him read it. And it was like, okay, what did we get wrong? What are we leaving out, or what could be taken out? And honestly, the original version of the project was supposed to tie in much more closely with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. That's actually how it all got started. I heard about that memorial and their dual marker for community aspect was really fascinating. And so I was actually talking to, I was my coworker who used to be in this office, and she mentioned that we're dual licensees. One of the NPR reporters knew Michael, and they got us in touch with him, and we sat down. And Michael's probably heard this story so many times, he's probably tired of it. But honestly, when we first sat down with Michael to talk about, well, what's your experience with your lynching exhibit? He's like, well, first you have to understand the story of Rufus Browder. And we're like, well, was he lynched? And he's like, no. And we're like, okay. I I thought we were going to talk about lynching. And he's like, just give me a second. And he begins to walk us through the story. And the entire time, Neil and I are looking at each other like, this is the story. Like, just hearing him tell it. I mean, we found ourselves like paying really close attention, pulling every detail out of it and trying to piece it along with him as he told it. So when we sat down and wrote this, the original idea was to have it be to follow the Sikh Museum's process of claiming the EJI marker while weaving in this historical story to kind of understand why something like this is so important. Now, naturally, the EJI, I don't know if they were quite prepared for the outpouring of interest they received, but it became very difficult to engage with them.
Yeah, I've experienced that a little bit with the work that some of us are trying to do in Mobile, where there's so many local community coalitions trying to work with them that it gets busy.
Yeah. So it became apparent that we're like, well, we're not going to be able to tie these two things together. And our original thought was, well, maybe we'll just do like a little short 30-minute short doc about the Rufus Browder story. So that way we can still get it told, and then come back and maybe get some funding and do a much larger piece. And when we just did the Rufus Browder story, the original cut was between 3 and 4 hours long. There's a lot there. And so we kind of sat down with Michael, sent him versions here and there and have him let us know. And, to Michael's credit, he gave us an enormous amount of freedom. It's just kind of like, I'll pick on you, Michael, for a brief moment. There's been times where I have to be like, you're not going to hurt our feelings if you say this needs to go or this is not accurate. It was one of those things where we wanted to make sure that this was very much a collaborative relationship, that we were trying to take the story he's been telling for 20 plus years, 30 plus years, and give it a visual platform to exist on. And so, it was, to give you a good example, the inclusion of the lynching photographs, that's something I struggled with. And I kind of still struggle with. I really don't like watching that part of the film. I've when you edit something, that part of the film takes up about roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes at the very end. That just kind of shows you all these examples of mob violence. And for that sort of section, I probably spent a week and a half just trying to figure out the right way to put that together. And so the question becomes like, are we furthering the aims of the mob, right? Because these photographs were taken with the aim to glorify these murders, and were circulated as an example of, look what we have done, look at what we have achieved, look at the power structure that we are maintaining.
Exactly. As a literature scholar, I sort of think about it in relationship to Claudia Rankine's poetry collection or experimental lyric collection, Citizen. She has this amazing moment where she takes an especially infamous 1930 lynching photograph. She features it in the collection, but she crops it so that the person who is murdered is no longer in the photograph, and the entirety of the photograph is the leering, horrible faces of the spectators. And shifting that focal point, of course, forces readers and viewers in the 21st century to reckon only with that fact of what the point of the photographs was, which was to maintain and reinforce white supremacist perspectives and to glorify the violence. And so she chooses to kind of take the murdered individual out of the photograph as a different type of artistic kind of a way to encourage shifting of focus, and get readers to think about what their relationship is to the original purpose of these souvenirs and these photographs. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and we actually had the same thought. In fact, my wife suggested that very technique. She's like, why can't you just focus, because there's many people proudly smiling.
Exactly.
In one case, next to
hence the ridiculousness of the name, right? Parties unknown.
Exactly.
And that phrase being used, because in so many of these occurrences, that is the most patent of falsehoods, right? And everyone in the community at the time, and even newspapers would document it, and people decades later through oral histories and things very much know who the parties are, right? That's part of the language that gets falsely used.
Now, what the reason why I chose not to go in that direction was based off of the lynching exhibit in Russellville, because that opening shot when you walk in, that's the experience you have. As soon as you walk in the door, it smacks you in the face. It immediately confronts you with this idea of there's not going to be any ambiguity about what we're dealing with. And that's kind of what I was trying to achieve with the photos. Sometimes we will start wide and we would push in on the faces so that the focus moves to them. But I felt it was very important to show the victims because, it's easy to, when we see the word lynching, it kind of goes back to that Stalin quote of, one death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic.
Yes.
And showing these victims pulls us away from the idea of a statistic and reminds us that these were people, that what these people are leering about and celebrating is the death of a person. And there was one particular photograph I really worked hard to try to include, but I could not find who held it, the copyright for it. But it was in a coffee table book that kind of explored the idea of lynching photographs. And in this particular photograph, it was a lynching that took place in Texas. It had to be very, very early because of what I'm about to explain, the techniques of photography. But it was a church congregation, about 50 or so people outside, and a black man has been hung on a pole, and they're posing with him. And in the early days of photography, the thing about the silver halide was, photographs were not as sensitive to light. So you had to remain perfectly still for the camera to really clearly register an image. And during this time period in photographic history, you had what was called death books, right? And so once it's too expensive and too labor stressful to do a photograph, so you'd wait until you were dead, and your family would dress you up and they would take a picture of you because a dead person doesn't move. And so it's around this early 1900s, late 1800s time period. And what was so striking about the photograph is here's 50, 60 church-going people, and you can't see a single face. It's blurred like something out of a horror film. The only evidence of humanity in that photograph was in the victim. And so that's, when I, presented what we had so far to Michael, is these questions where, if you see anything you disagree with or you want to have conversation with, we can take it out. But I tried to make those decisions based off of, my experience with Michael, the conversations we've had, the exhibit informing a lot of the direction that we would kind of go in, because it was very important to us to especially, the very end where we essentially have obituaries, as limited as they are for the 4 victims, the reminder that when these 4 men died, a hole was ripped into several families. And that, this wasn't a statistic. These aren't statistics. These are people. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that your father, your brother, your grandfather, your son, this was done to them. Like, it's something that some people, it's understandable, you don't come back from.
Laura, if I could jump in and ask a follow-up question to Josh and to Michael, as an educator, me as an educator, and I've never taught this material, and so when I think about what an analog would be for me, then I end up thinking about the times that I've taught Holocaust literature, and as a Jew and as an American Jew, also I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and grew up in essentially a Jewish ghetto that was inside of the African American ghetto that my family ran a butcher shop that catered to African Americans. So, but in that, coming back to my point, as an educator, when I've taught the Holocaust, what what you learn as you do it a couple of times, and I'm thinking about Hannah Arendt's book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I used to like to teach, which was a New Yorker piece, sequence of pieces, then put out as a book, is that the students, when they come in, they don't really have any idea of imagining how this could have happened. It's just beyond it's very difficult to come in and have some sense that it wasn't just some sort of like horror movie. And when you read something like Eichmann in Jerusalem, it walks you through the fact that this happened, and it was a very in the case of the Holocaust, it was a very systematic, and it's very kind of interesting to me, because the Nazis kind of prided themselves on coming in and stopping the Ukrainians or the Hungarians or whatever from going into a straight up sort of pogrom, old fashioned style. They found that uncivilized. They had a whole system where they shook everybody down, and then they put them in the camps, and then they killed them all, and that this was somehow better. But she can walk you through, Hannah Arendt can, the process, and then seeing the students grapple with the reality of having to process the fact that this is how it happened. Okay, this is how it happened. There must be a sort of similar process that you've experienced when you explain, and that as you see, because that's what's great about the film, is the film shows you how this happened. It can't lock in every detail, but it provides a clarity, frankly, to what the mind wants to believe human beings can't really do to each other. This is how that happened. Is that what you find when you've had the opportunity to share and get feedback on how people respond to the documentary?
Well,
Yes. You go for it, Michael.
oh, you got it. I'm gonna let you go.
Okay. Yes and no. Which is, of course, a non-answer. So we're a university licensee. Now, we've created content, curriculum content, through PBS Learning Media for 9th through 12th grade. And I hope that we're able to get some feedback onto how that curriculum is received and utilized. But because we're a university licensee with WKU, our entire crew are university students. And so because this project took over a period of 4 years, I got to see a lot of students come in and come out of our program and work on this project. And because Russellville's about 45 minutes from campus, there's an opportunity to sit and talk in the car, especially first timers, when they first meet with Michael, or we go into the exhibit and we, require footage, or we're running around town saying, well, hey, here's the spot where they were actually lynched, or here's the actual train station where Rufus was taken to kind of talk with them and kind of get a feel for, how are they grappling with it? And here's the problem is, the mob is almost a character in itself. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that it's made up of multiple people. So to kind of pin down the motivations and the processes is very difficult. Now, Michael and I have sat down in our spare time and kind of just, theorized about who's actually behind the mob and other stuff. And it's a very interesting conversation, but in the film, we don't really address that because it's kind of not the point. I had a conversation with one of the screenings, and was like, here's the warning sign for the documentary is, the mob is a group of people who are whipped up into a fervor through emotional stimulus. And to be careful, because it's easy to watch this film and be like, well, I can never do that. You need to ask yourself, well, could you? Like, given the right stimulus, could you not, get angry enough to do something? And I think when we have something like the January 6th, insurrection, it's easy to kind of see how this is very much a current real issue that can still happen when people believe that they are 100% right and that their will should dominate everything else. It becomes very dangerous. And so when people interact with us post viewing, what's really surprising is how much they get it. You know, it's one of those things where it's hard to put this into words. It's almost like there's this unspoken understanding that no one wants to talk about, but the film gives people permission to acknowledge that this was a horrible, horrible thing. I've had no idea, but I agree we should talk about it. I have yet to encounter someone who was like, what are you doing? Like this, we don't, you know, that doesn't mean they're not out there. It just means they're not vocalizing it. But you know, it's usually, we have a little post viewing card that we hand out to current screenings that asks some basic questions like, what did you learn from this film? Does challenge any perceptions? And if so, you know, how? You know, describe a moment in the film that you found particularly disturbing or moving. And then we coalesce these and collate them, and then we can kind of review them. And there's usually everything falls into one of two categories. One category is usually I had no idea how widespread this was. So they understood the reasons behind it, but they didn't quite realize just how widespread it was. The other one is it just confirmed what I already knew. And so it's these two groups trying to engage with them, that I think is the next interesting challenge as far as in these conversations, having, you know, one group that is like, I grew up with this. You know, I knew this was always possible. This is what they warned me about growing up to be careful of. And another group being like, well, we had no idea it was at this level. Right? It wasn't that it didn't exist, period, but it existed at this level. And I think Michael's work in the Sikh Museum is an excellent example of him, you know, bridging that gap. And this kind of speaks to what he said earlier, which is changing people's hearts. You know, it's in our minds, we've always known this is there. It's just in our hearts, we've tried to downplay it because it's easier for us to deal with. You know, it's easier to be like, well, it's not that big of a deal, or it's not as bad as we would think. You know, the thing with the Holocaust was, you know, post World War II, it was everywhere. You know, there's so much evidence for us to look at and just be horrified of. While at the same time here in the States, this information was being suppressed. You know, we don't want to talk about it. You know, we don't want to, you know, deal with it, to the point where it, you know, as you mentioned earlier, like, you know, 1980s, so, you know, some would argue, depending on how you define lynching, 1990s, or even a year or two ago.
Now, yeah.
So it's a yes and no answer.
Yeah, policing the sort of boundaries of what we're going to count as a lynching has always been a little bit of its own project of exerting false control and manipulating facts about American history to sort of posit that a progress or a trajectory is happening that, you know, is not necessarily happening, or is happening at least much more slowly than people want to believe it is happening. And I think in service of furthering conversations about that and awareness of that, the kind of work that both the Sikh Museum and this documentary are doing, that are, to my perception, balancing a very specific individual local story with its own nuances against the fact that this also speaks to larger patterns and a huge scope and scale of violence, is a really important, difficult balance, where kind of both versions of telling the story are important. You can't allow things to merely become statistics that people become desensitized to, but you also have to find ways to emphasize that these very specific, nuanced local stories speak to bigger patterns. And I think that's always a difficult balance to strike in trying to have have these conversations and honor the individual lives lost and the devastation on their communities and their loved ones against the need to make people realize how widespread it was, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Michael,
'cause
did you
it's-
want to comment at all on where we are in the conversation?
Well, I just want to say is that when we did the first exhibit in 208, we took a lot of teenagers in the neighborhood and we let them help us with the exhibit. And when we started out, a few of them were very hesitant. They didn't want to participate. They didn't want to do anything. So the way I got them involved, we were paying them to work every day. And I used a technique I use a lot with them. I had the court transcripts. So I told them, I need y'all to read these transcripts. We got to read all of them. We need to pull all the names and places out the transcripts. And I gave each group a little bit and let them read it and write down what they found. After I let them read those transcripts and they started to see that these people hadn't done anything wrong, the attitude changed a little bit. So you have to understand something about lynching. Even a lot of times these people were innocent. It was the state sometimes and the community, the newspapers, the judges, sometimes even the churches that got together to make them look bad. And in that, their families felt that they had done something bad. So most people felt it just comfortable just not to talk about it. Blacks didn't talk about it because they had said that they'd done something bad and they didn't want to be associated with that bad. The white community didn't talk about it publicly because they knew what they'd done. They knew exactly what they'd done. You know, when you talk about the mob coming to Russellville in 1908, what a lot of people don't realize, it was 3 mobs that came. They kept on shopping until they could kill somebody. You know, this is, most people think of these things as that, oh, they just happened. A lot of this stuff was planned and was planned by some of the most important people in the community.
And advertised in newspapers ahead of time.
Exactly. That's exactly how they done it. So the way I've learned to deal with it, especially with young people, is I give it to them. I give them the truth. And I don't think there's no other way to do it. I don't give the truth to young Black people and not give it to young white people. I give it to all young people. And it's like I told a man the other day, he told me, he said, well, don't you think that this is, how did he say it? Don't you think that this is too strong for kids to deal with? Why, hell, they're on the internet and the TV. What's strong in that? They're killing people every 2 minutes on TV. Come on now, you playing. What you're trying to do is hide again. You're trying to say, hey, you don't need to talk about this because it offends people. No, we need to talk about it. And the reason is to talk about it so these things don't happen to other people. By not talking about it, we open the gate for people to get comfortable and do these same things again.
And that's how we have, Elizabeth Alexander calls, young Black Americans the Trayvon generation because they have grown up with video access to this violence in their palms. And she's kind of urging people to think about the fact that that information, whether we like it or not, is very, very widely available to the youngest members of our population. And so if that's the only way that they're getting that information, we're certainly not getting anywhere in terms of having some sort of useful, transparent conversation about the histories and the presence of this violence, right? And so, yeah, telling a different type of truth to reveal these continuities is vital.
It's very important. You have to, like I said, there were 3 mobs. There were a mob on July the 13th that came to town. One of the guys who they lynched on August the 1st was in the town square. On July the 13th, they didn't lynch him at night. So it gives you, it tells you that a lot of this was premeditated. There was another mob that came, I think it was July the 16th or 15th to the Armstead area when they arrested these guys. And then there was the mob that came on August the 1st or the last day of July. So there were 3 mobs. Now, what they tell us is by parties unknown is the title, but what they told us at the coroner's jury and what everybody was led to believe, and they knew it all the time, is that everybody knew who was in the mob.
Mm-hmm.
There's still white people here now who know exactly what went on. You know, ain't nobody dumb. The reason I wanted to do the movie is by getting what we knew out there. Maybe somebody would finally break down and say, hey, I got this. I tell you what, now, when we were in Madisonville the other day, 2 guys walk up to me. My grandmother was 8 years old when all this happened. One guy walked up to me. He said, man, he said, you don't know me, do you? He said, no. He said, your grandmother was my nanny. I said, huh? He said, yeah. He said, your Aunt Deacon took care of me too. The other guy with him walked up to me. He said, I got this at the house. My granddaddy gave it to me. You know what it was? It was a picture of the lynching.
Mm-hmm.
He sent it to me the other day. So they know. This guy that I met in Madisonville, his cousin told me a week before, he said, did you know that my aunt had donated these glass slides to the Sikh Museum about 20 years ago that had this lynching on it? Well, when he told me that, I said, well, no, I didn't. So I go back to look for him. You know what has happened, don't you? One of those members about 20 years ago, before I got there, then took them and sanitized it. That's the way they've done the newspapers here. Because they didn't want people to know. They don't want people to see. And this happens not only here, it happened all over the United States.
Exactly. Part of the work that is winding up happening in local communities, partnering with the EJI to bring these memorials into, you know, the local area, as I know a little bit from firsthand experience in Mobile, is uncovering the ways a lot of these memories do survive if you can have the right conversations, gain trust of people, you know, and what has gotten passed down through oral histories that can then eventually, you know, be documented just as rigorously, but you know, thinking about that relationship between what gets preserved in community memory, right, and you know, what actually makes its way into more formal historical archives, winds up being really important to these stories, and thinking about making sure that we're honoring the validity of those oral historical components as well is very much part of some of these conversations, I think.
I
Yeah,
wanted
because I'm sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, remember your thought, but I wanted to ask again, as somebody who I don't, Laura, you know, is an expert and a scholar in this. I'm not. And one of the things about learning about how the lynchings in Russellville happen is the intervention of the African American, that society, where they're going in trying to adjudicate isn't quite the right word, but they're going in and trying to make an intervention in order to help. And they must do that, those with knowing full well that the risk is that they're going to end up getting lynched. And I mean, you know, that was new to me to realize, to imagine making that decision in my life to go do that. And I just wanted to know what you thought of to some degree, that act of heroism that is in the story.
Well, you look at it as heroism if you don't look at what's happened after the Civil War. Again, all of these stories have been hid. Nobody tells about how African Americans fought back.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody tells about this. Nobody tells about this. I'm talking about nowhere. But when you get down there and start digging deep, you'll be surprised how many people stood up for their rights. How many people try to fight against things, how many people done things. Now, it wasn't in the white community's interest to tell this either. Because if you tell about the people who fought back, then other people may start fighting back. So they just covered it all up. John Jones wasn't the only one when you look at Logan County. When you go to start looking at Logan County, you'll find that there were a lot of people who were fighting back. There were a lot of people who were doing things, you know. Another aspect of that is, too, you're going to find a lot of cases where there were blacks and whites working together. They never told that. Again, it wasn't in their interest to tell. If you're a racist, you don't want to tell that these black people and these white people are getting together and doing good things. Because what you're pushing is that all blacks are bad, they're animals, they're second class, you shouldn't be around them. So none of these stories of how African Americans and whites got together to do positive things have ever made it out. But when you go in these communities and you start looking and researching these court records, you'll find a lot of this in court cases and everything. Well, hey, there were actually people here working with blacks. But again, what happened was you intimidate and kill the blacks. You tar and feather and shun the whites and run them out of town. Now, you don't kill them, because if you start killing too many of them, then you're going to lose community support. But the community may support you tarring and feathering them. It may support you shunning them. It may support you boycotting their business. But it's not going to support you mass killing white folk, where it's going to support you mass killing black folk. And like I say, in my 40 years of doing all this, I think a lot of people really missed the boat on a lot of it. I don't think people are seeing it as clear as it really is. And I tell people all the time that you cannot condemn all white people in these lynchings and things, because a lot of times, a lot of people didn't go along with it and they try to fight it. And another aspect of this you have to be very careful of, and people don't like when I say this, but it's true. A lot of people miss the fact that when they went to get Emmett Till, it was black people with them that went to get him. They miss it. But again, we got to start talking about these things. We can't tell these stories to make black people feel good or make white people mad. We have to tell the truth. The truth will set you free. That is very important. I could not, and I did not want Josh to tell this story, and I did not want to tell it to make any one group look a certain way. And what I've appreciated, what they've done with this, they help tell the truth. That's all anybody wants, is the truth.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up Emmett Till, because I think it's there have been so many conversations recently in light of, there have been there's been, there was the really big mini series last year in January. There was the significant new movie about Emmett Till. But of course, by the same token, even as maybe a few more people are learning some of the nuances of the Emmett Till story, it also still feels like, especially in the aftermath of Tyree Nichols's killing, and seeing his parents have to become vocal advocates, the comparisons were rife between, Emmett Till's mother and Tyree Nichols's mother. And so it feels like telling more complicated versions of these stories is absolutely necessary, is unfortunately not enough, but is an absolutely necessary, step toward maybe eventually helping, fewer of these horrible contemporary outgrowths, to stop feeling like they're accruing all the time.
Josh, I interrupted you. Do you remember what your thought was as we kind of get to the 10-minute mark here of our time together?
Sure, I wrote it down, and I'm trying to find a good way to dovetail it into what we just talked about. But one of the things that made this story and easy is not the word to use, but I'm going to use it anyways. So easy to tell was Michael's dedication to the truth and his ability to collect all of these things. Because, you know, you mentioned like this idea of oral history and you know, as a folklorist as well, you know, this huge idea of oral history is very, very valid. It's a very valid form of historical documentation as well, because it provides us perspective and context. The problem about these lynchings, and Michael mentioned, you know, suppressing the truth, was this idea that the mob was very effective at what it did. You know, there's this shock public moment that is quickly followed by, now don't say a word, don't talk about it. You've got the message, put that away in your mind, and you need to continue on your daily business, knowing that we're in control. And he mentions in the documentary that it's a fear that's passed on, right? It's, you know, what's interesting is that's a fear that's passed on both sides of the narrative, because it's this idea of, you know, we did this because you should be afraid of Black people. They're dangerous. When you look at the newspapers, you know, the official documentation of the time period, you know, they mentioned John Jones was a brute and was a violent individual and had multiple run-ins with the law, right? It's almost verbatim, just change brute for thug, and it would have been written today. You know, Trayvon Martin was a thug who was a violent individual who had multiple run-ins with the law. Like, there's this justification. And what's interesting about this case is that while we have the oral history and we also have the official documentation as far as the media, which we have for a lot of lynching cases, what we have that's not necessarily unique but rare is Michael's research with coroner reports, the fact that this led to 3 trials where we have evidence and testimony that's continually gone over, and we have, you know, writings from the governor and from prominent individuals. You know, John Rhodes and Sims were prominent individuals here in Bowling Green. I mean, he wrote a letter to his daughter because he distinctly remembered the night the lynching happened. And so we're able to take these oral histories and we take this documentation, legal documentation, historical documentation, and we're kind of able to lay everything out. And we're able to kind of piece together an idea of, okay, what really happened? And there's still a lot of holes that we can't quite answer, but we still get at least a good solid idea of the fact that no matter how you slice this, no matter how you try to construe the interaction between Rufus and James, who started what, who shot first, whatever, it doesn't matter. These 4 men were murdered for no reason. And even if you had a good reason, they were murdered in one of the most atrocious way possible. And we talked about, you know, the intention of the mob and premeditation. And I brought this to attention to some of my students the other day because I always find this fascinating. The typed written note is something that we can dig into, right? 1908, typewriter. Having a typewriter in 1908 is the equivalent of having a desktop computer in 1977, right? It's there, it's possible, but it's an expensive commodity. And you have to have a good reason for having it, right? Not to mention, you don't take a typewriter with you out in the woods where you're going to lynch someone. So whoever typed this up, they did it before the attack. So right there, boom, it's premeditated. It was a literate and well-written statement. So it's someone it was premeditated by someone who had wealth, probably some kind of a power or influence in the town because they needed a typewriter, and they were educated. You know, so that by ourselves can tell us that this is not something the mob just said, hey, we're going to do this. Like they planned this. This was well executed. And these are all things that Michael laid out for us in our conversation that we tried to carry over into the film. So that way the film's essentially the experience Neil and I had in those 4 years listening to Michael and spending time with him. But that idea of, you know, these oral histories are very important. And what's interesting is how much they start backing up the narrative that we see emerging out of all this documentation. And it's, like I said, it's not unique, but it is rare for lynchings. And I think that's one of the reasons why this story was so easy to put into a visual format, because we had this documentation and then we had Michael to help us make sense of it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just wanted to mention that we've gotten some comments in the chat. and we're getting down to sort of final thoughts. But Jana writes, thank you for all your work documenting and educating people about this terrible event. We need to know such history to move forward. Only recently, the majority of Americans started to learn about the Tulsa massacre in 1921. And Alden also says, thanks for all the important discussion. And obviously I want to thank everybody for participating. But in the last couple of minutes, I just want to make sure that if there's something somebody wants to say, either Josh, Michael, Laura, or the other people that are on the call, the floor is open.
Well, all I'll say is that Adam, there are so many stories like these that need to be told. The guy said he was from Todd County a few minutes ago, and I was just wondering, I said, well, I wonder if he knew about the lynching down there in Guthrie. This guy had said something to this white woman, and they took him to the railroad train, which Guthrie was a place where all the trains came through. Vice President Stevenson was on his way to Hopkinsville because he just got elected. So he was going to Hopkinsville, and on his way back from Hopkinsville, as he gets to Guthrie, now this is the Vice President of the United States, there's a man hanging right there in the train yard. When you go all through Western Kentucky and a lot of these places, there are so many stories like these. The problem is getting them told and making people, well, you can't make them, but hoping people understand how important it is to tell the stories. And in telling these stories, you, in my mind, in getting them out there, you put protection on other people.
Right. Well, we certainly got a long way to go. I mean, if I had to ask one final question, it would be, again, I'm just listening, but has lynching ended? I mean, we have this sort of conversation as well as late as the 80s or the 90s. Has lynching ended?
George C. Wright, who Josh got to participate in the film, he said no. He said the state then took it over.
Yeah.
Right,
I think I kind of agree with him. Is that you're not taking them to the tree now, but if you give people sham trials and put them in jail all their lives, you put them on death row, even though you don't have a mob there doing it, the effect is the same.
Yeah. And it ties into that idea about the fear being passed on. I think it was just a few years ago, there was a situation in Florida where a Black social worker was trying to calm down one of his individuals, and an officer had him at gunpoint, and the man was sitting down on the ground with his arms up, and the officer just shot him. And the Black man said, why did you shoot me? And the officer said, I don't know. And I honestly believe he said, I don't know, because I feel like there's this, what the mob, what I just said before, was really, they were really effective at, was instilling a fear of white people towards Black people that was unfounded. And even though the state took over and said, we're going to take care of this, that fear became a current that still ran through. I mean, I mentioned the newspaper. We have to justify why this happens to these people because they're bad people. You should fear them. And so we question, we are surprised when individuals are the other, are the target of violence, that it's like, well, I feared for my life. Well, why did you fear for your life? It's because there's this narrative that's been continually perpetuated. So while we may not see, except for in January 6th, mobs of people moving across, that work is still part of the undercurrent of our narrative that you're separate races, which is, a fiction anyways, but also that you should fear them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you interact with these individuals, you need to be on your guard. And so I feel like that's where the mob mentality is still, reverberating. And I think that's kind of the next step is how do we readjust that narrative to understand that there's no reason to fear these people because they're people. If there's a reason to fear them, then you have a reason to fear me because, we're all essentially part of this community. and the mob has divided us. So how do we, and I think Michael's work with the Sikh Museum is a good step towards trying to reintegrate, and you begin this conversation with racial reconciliation. You know, I started this project and someone asked me a very profound question to define race, and I was very embarrassed to realize that I couldn't answer that question. And then they asked me, did I ever consider the fact that race was a construct? You know, there's no genetic difference between myself and Michael than there is between me and someone with red hair.
I'd like to say one more thing. When they had the George Floyd march here, we had a little panel and we had a discussion. And I was explaining to them, I said, you know, sometimes when I go in a store, these people will walk behind you like you're finna steal something off. I walk out of the store, somebody will lock the doors off. They see me beside their cars, they go in the store, they'll lock the doors. And I was explaining to them, you know, all this is based off just my skin color. They just look at my skin color and automatically get offended or get scared. Well, like I told them, I'm never going to change my skin color. So there are a lot of whites that are going to have to change their hearts. They're going to have to change how they view us. Now, people don't like me saying that, but it's the truth. If my skin color automatically offends you, how can I change that? There's nothing I can do about that. So it's nothing that I'm doing. It's something inside you that you've got to deal with.
Yeah, and hopefully we can all take steps toward dealing with it through grappling with important work like what you're doing at the museum and with the documentary, Michael and Josh. So thank you very much for furthering these conversations to try to get some more hearts changed, as you're putting it, especially as many of us are headed to Louisville, home of the kind of modern lynching, if people want to call it that, of Breonna Taylor, for instance, right? So yeah, thank you for this really important attention to the Russellville instances.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.